Um, Hello, everyone. Cliff Smith here. I am the Washington Project Director of the Middle East Forum, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series. Today, I have a guest who has a very unusual and interesting story, Mr. Len Khodorkovsky. Am I pronouncing that right?
Pretty close.
How would I pronounce it?
It's Khodorkovsky. You missed the K.
Khodorkovsky. Okay, excuse me.
Tripped up.
Mr. Khodorkovsky previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Digital Strategy, which worked on all manner of foreign policy issues, and then Senior Advisor for Global Public Affairs in the U.S. Department of State, working for then Iran envoy Brian Hook on communications issues, specifically related to the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. He was also involved in the Abraham Accords, peace between Israel and several Arab and Muslim majority countries, among other things. So welcome, Len.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Just FYI, due to scheduling issues, this webinar was pre-recorded. So unfortunately, we won't be able to take any audience questions this time, but I'm confident we'll find a lot to enjoy and try to answer the best questions I can. Len, let me start out with a more general question. Your undergraduate work was in political science, but your graduate work was in visual arts and graphic design. You spent a lot of time in advertising. You want to give me a brief sort of background on how you moved from the advertising world to international affairs?
Sure. Well, I guess it starts with my family arriving in the United States from the Soviet Union in the early 80s. And my parents really didn't give me too much of a choice as to what what profession I should go into. Because as most immigrants, the focus is on making sure you can earn a living, and that's where my parents were. So they told me I could be a doctor, a lawyer, or an accountant. So I kind of started along that path. I started in accounting, believe it or not. But soon thereafter, I think in intermediate accounting, I realized I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. So I gravitated toward political science because I felt like I could probably get into law from there. But political science really is what appealed to me, coming from a Soviet refugee family where, certainly communism played a big role in why we couldn't get out for a long time and eventually did get out. The politics were always a topic of conversation in our family. So I was always curious about it, always interested in it. And I ended up majoring in poli-sci. I didn't get into poli-sci though, because I discovered I don't want to be a lawyer either. So, and I felt like it was a long way to get to Washington from Rutgers at that time. So I did actually get into advertising and design pretty early because I did have an inclination for those sorts of things. And I started kind of like a startup right out of college along those lines. And eventually, as I was getting close to getting married, I figured I better get some steady work and steady pay. I went and got a master's degree at the School of Visual Arts in New York. And that kind of set me on the more sort of, I guess, a traditional path in advertising, where I spent 20 years, mostly in New York, being a creative director on advertising campaigns, having nothing to do with politics, but did eventually lead to an ad agency that had a guy named Donald Trump as a client. And after he won the election in 2016, I ended up coming to Washington to work on the transition team, and eventually, got an offer I couldn't refuse, which is, how would you like to serve your country? And it took me about 2 seconds to say yes, and I ended up in Washington at the State Department.
So in the State Department, were you particularly interested in the Middle East before coming to the State Department, coming from a sort of a Soviet background? What was the lens in which you viewed the Middle East when you started working on Iran, on the Abraham Accords related issues?
So I honestly, I was just happy to be there, to be honest with you. It was an opportunity to give back to the country that provided a second home to my family. And, there was a point in time in the summer of '81 where we were essentially running out of, from Soviet Union. We were homeless, and America provided a refuge for our family. So I felt really passionately. So did my family. When I told my parents I was being vetted for the State Department, first of all, they were speechless. But when they came about, I think they were more proud of that than when I told them they were going to be grandparents. So it really, it was just, I didn't have any high expectations to work on any particular portfolio. I just kind of raised my hand and said, whatever I can do, however I contribute with my skills and experience, that's what I wanted to do, which is how I got into the digital strategy, because that was aligned with my background. Now, in terms of the Middle East, again, it was just one of those opportunities that came about because Secretary Pompeo started the Iran Action Group when Brian Hook was, became the head of the Iran Action Group, and Brian had all the policy advice that he needed, but what he didn't have is a marketing guy. He didn't have a comms person, and again, I saw an opportunity to contribute to something significant, and I raised my hand, and fortunately, Brian and Secretary Pompeo thought that I could bring something to the table, and that's how I ended up working on Iran, and eventually from there, I ended up working on issues related to the Middle East and the Abraham Accords.
On that issue of digital strategy in Iran, excuse me if this was referred to differently in the State Department, they just say you were in charge of digital strategy in Iran, pretty straightforward. But and we all know, due to the last few elections in our own country, if nothing else, that governments all over the world try to use social media and other online platforms as part of their foreign policy. So simply put, what was our digital strategy on Iran during your tenure, and how did you formulate it?
Well, to take it back a step, when I came to the State Department, our government is pretty good at some things. It's terrible in some other things. One thing that it's terrible in is marketing. There is no marketing expertise in U.S. government, and I don't know whether that's the case in all governments, but I know in our government that is a gap that needs to be filled. So in some respects, I felt like I needed to bring the team up to speed as to the best practices out there in this realm, to take the approach that is second nature in the private sector, but was a foreign concept, pun intended, at the State Department. So basically, I just wanted to make sure that we operated as scientifically as we could, trying to solve strategic challenges. When in the private sector, you get a client, and the client has a strategic goal that they want to accomplish, and they use marketing and advertising to accomplish that goal. And I want to take the same approach with our foreign policy. So, what's our strategic? What's the top strategic priority we want to accomplish when it came to Iran or China or any other topic, and tailor the marketing strategy, the communication strategy toward that objective. And I think we eventually, got pretty good at it. That was my objective number one. In terms of what was our specific strategy on Iran, look, there were a couple of major initiatives that the Trump administration was taking, starting with leaving the JCPOA, the Iran deal. That was actually my first big project on Iran that I had to tailor a messaging strategy around. Now, we knew that it was controversial in some circles. It is what President Trump said he was going to do on the campaign trail. So it didn't come as a surprise, but it was still controversial. The most important thing about the communications of this policy approach was to make sure that the Iranian people themselves did not feel that we were targeting them. This was an approach for us to deal with the revolutionary Islamic government in charge. The Iranian people didn't look at that government as truly representative of their needs. They pretty much had, have exhausted all their patience with the government. So one of the key objectives of the communications was to make sure that despite all the rhetoric and all the propaganda that we're going to hear from the Iranian regime, they understood that uh, how this policy is going to impact them. And the other part of that is to maintain open lines of communication with the Iranian people, as opposed to going through the channels that filter the information to them. So we focused on explaining the policy and ensuring that we were clear in trying to understand and represent their needs, to make sure that they understood that the United States government and the American people really do want a relationship with the Iranian people, but they did see the government itself as their as their adversary, and so did we. So we actually were allies in that.
Were there methods of getting around Iranian censorship and such that you used?
There are always overt and less overt ways of achieving means, especially in when it comes to regimes like this that try and crack down on internet services. Certainly, I don't know if you recall, but in 2019 there was a big uprising in Iran. I think it was 200 cities. It was multiple demographics. It wasn't just students. It wasn't just truck drivers. It wasn't just Azaris versus Kurds. It was all of society uprising in 2019. And one of the ways that the Iranian regime responded to it is by shutting down the internet, which was a very the reason they did that, and the reason all of these dictatorships try to pull stuff like this, is to prevent the information from coming out as to what they're really doing. And the regime, ended up killing about 1,500 people in 3 days. And I'm sure they would have wanted that information to be not to be circulated in the free world, but we certainly did what we needed to do to make sure that information did get out, and the voices of the people got out, and the voices of dissidents, and the true story got out. And in fact, it did shine a spotlight on the brutality of exactly what was going on in Iran, and it made it harder to for folks that were predisposed to sweep that stuff under the rug and trying to prioritize JCPOA, for example, to be able to do that. And I think the Iranian people were very thankful of at least the attempts that we showed to stand with them and make sure that their voices were amplified. So yeah, I mean, we did have a concerted effort to make sure that the voices of the Iranian people were represented and the truth got out.
I read that you have spoken openly of your admiration for Natan Sharansky. He's a hero of mine as well. One thing I always understand is the distinction between a free society and a fear society. Does that sort of way of looking at the world, I mean, were you thinking about sort of the fear society of places like Iran or other adversaries when you were formulating your messaging and strategies?
Undoubtedly. So as a Soviet immigrant, as a Soviet refugee, I can't say that I stack up to Natan Sharansky when it comes to his accomplishments or the ordeal that he went through to gain freedom. But he was always a hero of mine, and certainly someone that my family looked to as and was proud of. In terms of being a leading dissenting voice on issues related to freedom, really, because that's really what was missing, certainly for most people in those societies, in the Soviet Union and Iran and Venezuela and China, all of these closed societies. But for us particularly, he was an example of simple, an individual with a clear message being able to overcome a regime that seemed impenetrable.
Mhm.
So I always did look. I read his books, and when I got older, when I got more into these issues, and fortunately, I did get a chance to meet him
Hmm.
at some point, and it was one of the highlights of my career and my life, where we did get a chance to, shall we say, schmooze about the old country,
Mhm.
and talk about the current challenges and foreign policy issues like Iran and human rights and things like this.
Mhm.
And he actually this is something you have been involved with as well, which is highlighting the role of the former Iranian regime officials embedding themselves in American universities, and I discussed that with him as well. And he was very, very gracious, actually, in recording a message trying to explain to, in this instance, to Oberlin University, Oberlin College, why it's troubling that Mohammad Jafar Mahalati, who happens to be the professor of peace, believe it or not, at the Oberlin College, why that was a troubling thing, and why Oberlin College had a role to play to stand for its mission of defending human rights and standing up for freedoms, how that was incompatible with giving tenure to someone who is complicit in human rights abuses
Mhm.
and crimes against humanity. So Natan Sharansky to this day um, is vocal about not just issues related to anti-Semitism or issues related to Jewish diaspora, but he is a voice of substance and on issues around human rights in general, the Iranian people's rights, the Uyghur rights in China, things like this, which make him a true human rights beacon, icon. And I respect that, and I'm proud to have met him, and I'm proud to have tried to embed some of those values that I read in his books and that I've discussed with him in the way that certainly I saw the struggle between freedom and authoritarianism, and regardless of where it took place. So yeah, I do. That's a long way of saying absolutely that world vision is certainly something that's been part of my outlook on events.
Um, you already also stepped to another issue I was going to ask you about. You mentioned Professor Mahalati. There's also Professor Masavian at Princeton. These are clear, I mean, obvious, open former regime officials that I think it is undeniable to say they were involved in various human rights abuses and crimes against humanity. Um, I guess two things. Are these isolated instances, or is this part of a larger strategy? And what should America do with issues like this?
I love America for its freedom. I love America for the opportunities it offers. I don't love when bad guys take advantage of these opportunities and our institutions not just look the other way at it, not just um, our discover these things by accident, but enable these things.
Mhm.
So it's very hard for Oberlin or Princeton, for example, to argue that they don't know the backgrounds of the people that end up teaching American students, in their universities. I frequently wonder, parents who pay, I don't know, upward of $80,000 a year to send their kids to these pricey universities. Do they really know who's teaching their kids and what they're being taught?
Mhm.
Do they know that human rights abusers are teaching their kids about issues related to religion or foreign policy or human rights, even in the case of Mahalati? I still can't get over the professor of peace moniker that he's been able to pick up.
Pretty
Um,
early.
yeah, no. Look, I mean, I think the way to address this is, yeah, obviously there needs to be pressure. They need, all of this needs to be brought into the sunlight so that people know what is going on, because I believe most people don't. And once people have all the information, the boards of trustees of these universities, the administrations of these universities will have to answer, and that's the step number one. We need accountability for this. People should know about this. Now, in terms of having rules about who can and can't be called a professor, or who can and can't be hired at a particular university, I'm a free market person. I'm certainly don't want government involved in things that the Constitution forbids government to be involved in. So I'm a proponent of that, but I do think there needs to be accountability, and information needs to be public. And they owe it certainly to the parents. They owe it to the students. These universities, they owe it to the public, whose tax dollars go in subsidizing a lot of these universities and programs. I wonder if a lot of benefactors of these universities realize that their money is funding this kind of an operation. So I believe that once all the information is out and people know about it, that the right decisions will be made. The other major point, and that's something you have discussed as well, which is the preponderance of foreign money in American schools. Not just schools, but in too many places in the United States that have influence over our policy, or over actually our rights when it comes down to it. Things like censorship and surveillance in the case of China, and certainly it's in their interest. It's in the interest of regimes like in Iran or China or Russia to be able to muddy the waters when it comes to issues related to things that are uncomfortable for them. So I do think there needs to be some congressional role in ensuring that foreign entities and foreign powers are unable to fund programs on American campuses that are contrary to our rights and are contrary to our national security interests. I think that's kind of a common sense approach, and I do believe that Congress can do more on that front.
Yeah. Moving on to another issue. You ran social media operations during the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. Obviously a big event, talked about for decades. Were you more concerned about the potential of it provoking a negative reaction, as some critics feared, or were you more interested in providing a positive impression of the event when you were formalizing this?
So my job as the digital strategy lead at State Department was to make sure that we accurately conveyed the information and the initiatives related to our foreign policy. So that's just the basic job description. Now, in terms of the strategic role, yes, of course, I was aware of the potential controversy, which to me personally, on a personal level, was misplaced. There was bipartisan agreement about the issue of Jerusalem being Israel's capital. Congress passed the Jerusalem, I think, Act in '95. So the Congress has mandated the movement of our embassy to Jerusalem since '95 at least. So the American policy here was clear, and it was not controversial. There was alignment. And frankly, I represented the people of the United States, not anyone else, when I served at the State Department.
Sure.
So it wasn't that controversial to me. However, of course, obviously, I was aware of the so-called controversy beyond the American administration. But no, I think my objective, and this is another one of those best practices that I was trying to bring to what we were doing, was to make sure that the coverage of the event was framed and conveyed accurately. And we led the coverage of that event. To me, a lot of government operations compare themselves to other governments. To me, the important thing about communicating our policy priorities is to make sure that they get let me start that again. So one of the important things, one of the important priorities of bringing our messaging up to speed with the real world, it was to make sure that the State Department and our comms operation led on issues that we cared about. Now, we're not competing with other governments. We're competing with other news outlets, not just in the United States, but around the world. And the way issues get framed, when people search for them, or look for information about them, is decided not by us, but decided by search engines, for example, or decided by news outlets or editors in various publications. So part of my job, as I saw it, was to make sure that we framed the things that we were leading first. We were breaking our own news, not some third party. And to that extent, part of the challenge of handling the coverage of the Jerusalem embassy opening was to make sure that the embassy opening was framed in a way that the policy intended it. So, for example, we worked with Snapchat at the time to make sure that we gave them behind-the-scenes access to all the things that led up to the opening, covered the opening in an exclusive way, to make sure that that audience didn't get information from third parties about what was being said, why it was important, who was doing what, but they received information firsthand. And I believe at the end of the day, we ended up communicating this important policy initiative to an audience that would have otherwise not have gotten accurate information. We ended up, I think, getting 7.5 million views of the embassy opening on Snapchat, which I think was a win for accuracy in my mind. So that was kind of the approach. And in terms of the fallout of the actual moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, what people thought about it and what they didn't think about it, was less relevant to me as a communications specialist. What was important to me is to make sure it was conveyed accurately and framed in the way that it was intended.
Running out of time, but maybe two more questions. You talked about being in the room when you first heard the term Abraham Accords, and you believe it was the first time that was uttered. Can you discuss your role there and how it affected things going forward?
Sure. Abraham Accords was, which came about in the last few months of the Trump administration. And it was like 4 agreements within the span of 4 months, probably. 5 if you include Kosovo. That concept in itself was brewing for a while, but not with the moniker of Abraham Accords, but rather, I think it was a byproduct of our policy toward Iran, I believe. Now, because the Trump administration reversed the Obama administration's policy regarding Iran, we exited the deal, we imposed maximum pressure. We found, we regained trust among our allies in the region, in the Middle East, certainly with Israel, the Gulf countries, the Gulf Arab countries. And we found a lot of common ground to have conversations on issues, certainly about related to security, but beyond that as well. And when people found themselves in the room talking about these things and finding common ground, they saw possibilities for something beyond collaboration on Iran. So out of those conversations eventually came whispers of potential, peace deals, things that haven't been uttered for a long time. Now, at the same time, the administration was trying to push an Israeli-Palestinian agreement. If you remember, there was a Peace to Prosperity Summit in Bahrain, and I guess, led with the economic portion of that plan and then eventually followed with a political plan. But that was another milestone and step toward normalization with the countries that were involved in the region. And when the Palestinians, unfortunately, as they seem to always do, not miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, when they missed another opportunity to create a better life for Palestinian people, when we sought other possibilities, and at that point, the possibilities of peace deals with other Arab countries, became a viable possibility. So the words Abraham Accords themselves was almost kind of a throwaway line that I heard in one of the meetings during that whole process. Not probably in I want to say in 2019, probably, where we were talking about the possibility of future peace with between Israel and its Arab neighbors, and someone just kind of threw out, "Hey, wouldn't it be cool to have this Abrahamic Brotherhood in the region, or something along those lines?" Obviously, both religion, Islam, Judaism, being connected to Abraham, and there's a biblical connection. The people themselves are cousins in the truest sense of the word, and it sort of seemed like a shame for cousins to not be speaking to each other for such a long time. And when the cousins started speaking to each other, it seemed that family reunification was inevitable. So, at that point, that idea of the people, Israelis, Emiratis, Bahrainis, Gulf Arab states, or even all Muslims in the region and beyond, and Israelis being able to reconcile, became something feasible. And so at that point, somebody recalled the Abrahamic moniker, and it stuck. And I believe the official title of Abraham Accords, I think, came about the last minute. It was, people were busy putting them together, and then we needed to call them something. And I think somebody just remembered that that's how we discussed them. And it literally was a last minute addition to the process. And, Abraham Accords, of course, from a branding perspective, I think it's brilliant. I can't take credit for it, but I'm glad it's there.
Perhaps for utilizing it. Any last thoughts on the Middle East and how information flows, and how the State Department and other government entities deal with those kinds of things?
Sure. Well, I'm disappointed as to the trajectory of our policy toward the Middle East in the last few years. I think when the Trump administration left office, we had the region. We had probably the best relations with various countries in the region in a really long time. There was trust. There was collaboration on strategic issues. I think we took quite a few steps backwards in that respect. I'm disappointed about that. I think it opens the door to players like China, as we saw, recently. And China and Russia are always looking for gaps they can fill in the region. Unfortunately, we've allowed them to do that, and I hope that the administration will listen to the people in the region. I think that's step number one. We can't make decisions for people living in the Middle East from outside of the Middle East. They know what it takes for them to have stability and prosperity. That's probably why JCPOA in and of itself was a fool's errand, because all the decision making of that process was done without the participation of players at the table from the region, and it was doomed for failure. And unfortunately, this administration, the Biden administration, forgot that lesson, and I think we need to get back there and make sure that our friends in the region are at the table regarding all the issues that are important to them, and that's the best way for the United States to keep its relevance and make sure that our voices are heard on the issues that pertain to our national security.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khodorkovsky. Appreciate it, and look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
see.